This was a serious bail contest in a case that is legally and politically about as heavy as it gets. Inside the courtroom, it was packed with more than 50 journalists, and Robert Smith appeared on the video link wearing a green prison jumper. He was clean shaven, he was sitting upright, and he was ready to go. Now, let me remind you, all of this media attention, and we're just talking about a bail hearing here. This is not a trial. This is not to figure out whether he's guilty or innocent. It's just about bail, and that's about whether or not someone will be released while the case progresses and under what conditions that release is going to be under. So just a reminder, Ben Robert Smith has been charged with 5 counts of the war crime of murder, and those murders were alleged to have occurred in Afghanistan between 2009 and 2012. So the prosecution in this bail hearing, they stressed that the maximum penalty that Ben Robert Smith could be receiving would be life in prison. And that's relevant when it comes to bail laws, because it goes straight into the talks about risk, because we know the higher the stakes, the more serious the offense, the more serious the possible sentence, there's a potential that a person is not going to turn up. And that's exactly how the bail fight played out. The prosecution focused on the seriousness of the offense, and the defense said that any kind of bail conditions that could be implemented, they would be able to mitigate all of those risks. They'd be able to control the situation so that Ben Robert Smith would be able to be released while this whole matter is being determined. Let's break down what happened in the bail hearing. The defense was focusing on probably the main concept, which is time, and that would be how long this whole thing would take from start to finish. And rightly so, they did say this would take over years, because by the time it took to get all of the evidence together, to have the procedural hearings, and to have the matter heard by a court, to have a decision and potentially appealed after that, then this is likely to take years. And Ben Robert Smith has already spent over a week in prison. He hasn't been found guilty of anything at this stage. So it was a chance for him to come out of prison and live his life normally, or as normal as could be, whilst this thing is ongoing. The defense also focused on another thing that was specific, I guess, to this case, which is the fact that there's going to be so much information to do with national security. And because there's so much confidential and sensitive information, there's going to be so many court rules around what sensitive material can be disclosed, what can't be disclosed, how it can be used, who can see it. And so all of those things are going to be, procedural hearings that occur along the way, which is going to exacerbate the time that this is taking from now to when it goes to a trial. One thing that the defense also stressed on was the fairness of the proceedings, and whether or not procedural fairness will be compromised if Ben Robert Smith had to defend himself from custody, because of the mountain of evidence that needed to be reviewed, or because of the complexity of this case. How would he be able to communicate with his lawyers? How would he be able to prepare properly? Because it's such a complex case. We're not just talking about a one-off incident that occurred last year. We're talking about incidents that occurred over a decade ago, and there's volumes and volumes of material to kind of review and prepare. How would he be able to do so from the confines of a prison cell? He would need to be out of his prison cell. He would need to be out in the public. He'll need to be able to confer with his lawyers on a consistent basis in order for a fair trial to go on. So a big point for them was about procedural fairness and giving Ben Robert Smith the best possible avenue to prepare for his case. Another thing the defense did was they focused on the character of Robert Smith, and they said that because of his character, he would be a manageable bail candidate. He's 47 years old. He had no criminal history, a long military background, a strict adherence to all protocols. And he'd been under investigation for years with, of course, his previous defamation trial. He had gone overseas in the past. He'd returned. His father is a former judge. So all of those factors were contributing to his character. And they were saying that he's a low risk of running away or trying to avoid these proceedings because there hasn't been any history around him doing so. I also think the defense did a very good job in packaging all of this up. They offered very strict bail conditions because they understood the seriousness of this case. So they offered a surety that needed to be paid. They made sure that there are strict reporting requirements, that he's not able to contact any potential witnesses that are involved with the case. So all of these conditions made it a little bit easier for the court to accept and to release Ben Robert Smith back into the public. And I think they did actually a really good job in packaging it all up, getting his character into place, putting the strict conditions and explaining why bail was so important in this case. Now let's go over to the prosecution side, and the prosecution's core message here was that the seriousness of these offences, the maximum penalty, life in prison, and because of the gravity of this matter, that bail would just not be suitable for Ben Roberts-Smith. They were concerned with two key areas. The first, that he might fail to appear back to court. That might mean him going overseas. And the second one is if he was to tamper with any evidence or speak to any witnesses about that. The problem that they had was they didn't really have enough there to substantiate that Ben Roberts-Smith would try and tamper with any witnesses or speak to any witnesses and therefore destroy the case. Posed these kinds of issues as more hypotheticals than anything else, and that really, I think, fell down to their disadvantage. Part of what the prosecution did as well is they tried to explain parts of the case and the strengths of their case, and they did this in order to show that they think that they're in a strong position and it's likely that Ben Roberts-Smith is going to be found guilty, and they do this in order to kind of convince the court that Ben Roberts-Smith is going to end up in jail anyway, so why don't we just keep him in jail in the first place? They tried to kind of project the evidence that they had and convince the judge that because of the mountain of evidence in their end, that he shouldn't release Ben Roberts-Smith on bail. So after both sides presented their arguments, the judge paused the case and he asked everyone to come back into the courtroom. He had to think about it, Judge Greg Grogan, and he found that the matter is very likely to take years before being resolved, and he granted bail to Ben Roberts-Smith. And he found that the prosecution's case, their arguments, all of that could be alleviated by the strict conditions that the defense had argued, including, those constant check-ins, those mandatory reporting, and making sure that there were strict conditions in him contacting any witnesses. Ultimately, bail is a risk assessment that the judge needs to make, and the court needs to ask this question: is there an unacceptable risk that a person is unlikely to appear, that they're going to be tampering with evidence, that they're going to be going to witnesses and pushing witnesses over the edge? If the court is satisfied that there is an unacceptable risk there, then bail won't be granted. But in this situation, the court was satisfied that Ben Roberts-Smith wouldn't pose that threat. So where to from here? Ben Roberts-Smith hasn't entered any pleas yet. He hasn't declared whether he will be pleading guilty or not guilty as of now. However, we know that from the previous proceedings, the defamation proceedings, he constantly denied all of the allegations towards him. So I can almost guarantee that he is going to be pleading innocent. That means we're going to be seeing a trial unfold in a few years' time, with a lot of procedural dates occurring from now until then. Let me know your thoughts. Do you think the court got it right with their application to approve bail for Ben Roberts-Smith? He is now amongst the public. And if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. I'm going to be continuously tracking this story. I'm an Australian lawyer, and I do like to provide analysis on ongoing cases, as well as providing bits of legal advice here and there that you might find useful. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next one.